In this podcast, I, Dr. Steph, talk with Professor Grant Schofield about topics from episode 1 of Dr. Steph's Shower Hour, the birth of showers. Hi, Grant, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today. Um, One of the big things we're going to talk about is therapeutic cold shock, but we'll probably end up talking about all sorts of other interesting things. I just thought you might like to introduce yourself for those who don't know you.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me, Stefan. I'm Grant Schofield. I'm a professor at AUT, Auckland University of Technology, and you have to be a professor of something. So my of something is professor of public health. But I suppose when I think about what that word means to me, it's about health span. So I'd probably rather be a professor of health span. No one really know what that means, but it's like if you're going to have a life living, then the years that you're alive might as well be functioning and well, and that sort of fulfillment in life would be maximized. Not necessarily talking about happiness, because life goes up and down, but yeah, how to do your health span. So I've really been interested in everything from exercise and fitness to diet to saunas to cold to psychological techniques. In fact, I was originally a psychologist, but I'm not actually the best psychologist, because I like to find the answers to things. And of course, good psychologists just shut up and listen and help people find their own solutions, which isn't really my thing. So,
It was your interest in cold water actually that led me to find you, because I was sort of looking at how cold water might be used therapeutically these days. Um, so that was how I found you. But of course, my study was about historical use of cold shock, which was for mania. So the psychology angle has an interesting link as well. But
so such an interesting word, mania, what that meant in a historical sense. What does it even mean?
it is very hard to know, and it seemed to have quite a wide application. It sort of
And is
seemed
that
to be
different from
being a bit
hysteria?
naughty. It
Right.
did seem to be. Yeah,
Okay, that's interesting.
obstreperous lunatics and maniacal men and women. So,
Oh,
yeah,
great words.
yeah, yes. I
Yeah.
wonder if it was, mania, how we might think of it today, but that's hard to know.
Yeah.
But you were interested in cold water for a very different sort of modern um, take on health. So I was interested in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of modern. It shouldn't have been modern, because one of the ways to think about health is um, there's a couple of different ways that health gets presented to us, and one is in the modern, what I call sickness system, which is it's very good at a few things. If you get quite sick from something, or if you're injured, then providing you can actually get through the emergency department or get through the waiting list or whatever it is, then that care is actually pretty an amazing feat of technology and science, really, that's evolved over the last couple of centuries. But that system is actually not very good at either preventing you getting sick from the main burdens of things like chronic disease, and including diabetes, stroke, heart attack, cancer, neurological things, nor helping you not have your mental health go down the plug hole. And you wonder why that is. And so I just want to sort of talk about this, because I think this historical bit's important, is that perhaps one of the things that happened was back in the 1850s, Louis Pasteur, the Frenchman microbiologist and scientist, discovered microbes and therefore bacteria, and also penicillin. This is to antibiotics, and said, well, there's these pathogens in the world that you can kill, and they can cause harm, and we should kill them. And in fact, that's an important thing, and that's true, and that saved millions of lives. It was interesting. His contemporary at the same time was another Frenchman called Antoine Béchamp, and he really was giving quite a different theory, and their sort of scientific arguments ended up with Pasteur winning, mainly because Pasteur was 100% right, and Beauchamp was only 50% right. But Beauchamp's idea was that well, Louis, it's interesting that there's all these bad bacteria, but how come some organisms get exposed to them and they're just fine? In fact, they thrive. Others seem to nothing happens, and others end up dying. There's more to it than just the bacteria. There's also the terrain of the organism, which is 100% right. That's a really important thing. So the robustness of the specimen under attack from something is an important thing of that outcome. Unfortunately, he had this whole thing about these things in cells called microzymes, which there's no such thing, and so he wasn't actually right in his mechanisms, and so arguably that idea of the terrain being important in health was really lost, and you could argue that modern medicine is really the antithesis to what would happen if you followed germ theory to its bitter end. And nothing would be more obvious than they say mental health, right? You've got anxiety or you've got depression. Here, take this here pill, this SSRI, and that should relieve your symptoms, as if a lack of that particular neurotransmitter was the cause or the solution to anxiety or depression, and which it turns out not to be. So those medicines hardly work above placebo, and they can cause harms. And so the question is, can you do medicine that is more terrain based? And the answer is yeah, and that's what I think modern medicine should do. And so the modern view of this terrain theory is something called hormesis, which is that for someone to be robust, then they need some stress. And so the most obvious thing about that is exercise, right? You go out for a run, you haven't been running, you do damage to your muscles and put stress on your heart and lungs, and the next day if you went for a run again, you'd be even worse than you were the day before. So you haven't improved, you've got worse by causing damage, but give some time for recovery and you bounce back. And so then the question is, what are the tools in the hormetic medicine toolkit? And well, there's fitness, and this whole hot and cold seem to be important things there, because the act of getting quite cold seems to have profound immediate stressful effects across the body. Obviously, if you stayed in it long enough, you'd die. That's not really the idea. And if you get out and you can warm up and you do that regularly, then your body becomes a more robust version of itself. And the same is true for sauna in slightly different ways. Of course, the thing about cold versus hot, we've got about 30 times more cold receptors than hot receptors. So cold can be a little bit more challenging in the initial immersion of getting into cold water. I've got a chest freezer at home that we just freeze to the top of and then break it up the top with a hammer, and we'll take turns jumping in there, and that can be pretty brutal. Or you could just go down to the beach. In most parts of New Zealand, especially in the winter, that's at a perfect temperature, stay there 5 or 10 minutes and it get a bit cold, and it seems to have profound effects. And then the question is, well, what's going on there in your mind, your brain, and physiology? So I think there's probably a whole bunch of things to explore there, from the physiology of your fat to brain chemistry to being outdoors, breathing, a whole bunch of mind techniques that you need to get through that. Those things are all at least interesting to me.
I mean, so many interesting things. It's such a vastly different idea, I suppose, to what I was what I was reading about was sort of forced water, 90 minutes of water being poured on someone's head to send them back to sleep with their husband, after being a wayward wife. So it was a very
more of a punishment sense.
Yeah.
Although there is there historic things where people have gone into cold and hot water at various times for therapeutic reasons. I think that's probably a thing.
I mean, I think the thinking was it was sort of at a similar time to the Louis Pasteur a little bit earlier, but they were sort of
Mm.
starting to look through things with microscopes and dissect bodies, and they decided that it was inflammation of the brain that was the problem. And so pouring cold water specifically on the head was meant to reduce inflammation of the brain, which is interesting. And,
That's interesting because there is some, evidence for that in modern terms, right?
inflammation has become a really interesting concept again.
Yeah.
So it's interesting for me to see, yeah, inflammation coming up again, but um, uh, talked about in quite different ways now. But we
Yeah.
certainly know, yeah, cold water constricts. So the theory was there.
Well, and also there is some more evidence on top of that. So one thing that's used medically is if you go to North Shore Hospital near where I am and see this, sometimes with say neonatal hypoxia or ischemia in the brain after a heart attack, and both of those you haven't got oxygen to the brain, and you've had brain cell death, and what happens with that, and the same reason a traumatic brain injury does the same thing, is that you get this sort of downward cascade of biochemistry. And one of the problems is that the most prevalent neurotransmitter in the brain is called glutamate, and it's excitatory. And when that gets too much of that being released, over expression of the fight or flight response and these sorts of things, or big one-off stresses like post-traumatic stress type things, then that seeps out into other spaces around the brain and then over stimulates the receptor as well, and that is called glutamate excitotoxicity, and it kills neurons.
Mm.
And then the problem with that is that there's 12,000 times more glutamate inside a cell than outside it, and when the cell dies, it spills it all out. But something like hypoxia or ischemia in the brain or a brain injury will do the same thing to start the process off, and you can see that's a downward spiral. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is that what you might do under these cases is induce hypothermia, and actually, interestingly, also use intravenous magnesium because it helps with the receptor. But this cold water really down regulates glutamate. And if people don't really want to pick neurotransmitters to talk about poor mental health particularly, but they did, and it was serotonin, and it's probably not really the most important one. I think glutamate by far is much more important. And if you start to look at where all the neuroscience is going with that, glutamate is the thing, and cold has such a profound effect on re-regulating glutamate. So I think that's there is actually some biochemistry now behind that. And if you're inflamed as well, then you're less likely to be able to remove glutamate normally, and presumably cold can help with that. So I think there is actually a physiology of cold and inflammation in the brain and these things. So
Yeah, well, I mean, hydropathy at the time was, really a very popular science. And it was interesting because it didn't really seem like they stopped doing it because it didn't work.
Okay.
They stopped doing it because it killed people.
Yeah, well, that's an issue, right?
And we would look at it today absolutely as torture, and it's just became sort of intolerable for a physician to dump
So,
a lot of water on someone.
yeah, so they could have had a more moderate sort of therapeutic technique, and people do that now, right? You can do that with anxiety. You can give people sort of cold water immersion, and I think particularly if you're able to combine it with a bit of breath work, especially sort of that's box breathing through the nose, and people have done clinical trials on that, and it's quite effective in helping people manage anxiety, which is interesting because you would think, well, it is. No one looks at a cold body of water, especially a chest freezer, and goes, this will be awesome. Like you look at it and you naturally feel anxious, and you think, oh my gosh, I'm going to treat someone with anxiety by making them anxious. That just doesn't seem right. But it can be quite effective.
I suppose a big difference is really about the person electing to do it, which
Well, that is a good point.
They weren't chained to a chair.
Well, I mean, historically, that's been a problem of mental health, right? Is that, from electroconvulsive therapy to, lobotomies to, by the sounds of this, cold water therapy, none of it was pleasant, and none of it was and we still do that. We section people in mental health and give them antipsychotic drugs. I think that's utterly perverse.
Yeah. Yeah. No. One of the things that you had talked about, and something else I saw you speak on, it was on, I think, your Pacific podcast, or you were interviewed for Pacific. You were talking about something called fused ideas that I wanted to just ask you a little bit about, because the idea, although it was looking at inflamed brains and wanting to cool the brain, there was I thought that there was some unknown connection between passions, sort of moving on a bit from humors, passions, the will, the spirit, and becoming sort of fixated on an idea, and that they had the idea that all these things were somehow, that fixating on an idea would inflame the vessels of your brain and cause mania.
Well, yeah, it's quite processing truth in that, as so far as the word I see it. So what I was talking about there is the idea of a sort of cognitive process called fusion or diffusion, sort of either end of those. And it comes from a broader set of psychological techniques called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And I'm really fond of them. To be honest, though, I hadn't heard of them until just recently. And I'd trained as a psychologist and done 7 years of psychological training and never really heard of it. And then you look it up, and it's really sort of advancement on general cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's really easy to understand. And I've at least found it really useful in my own life, and used it with others as well. So there's really two parts to it. So it's this first part's called acceptance, and the other part's called commitment. So that makes it reasonably simple. And the acceptance part is sort of a little bit to the opposite of what you think about in general psychology. So often in cognitive behavioral therapy, people say, "Oh, some of these things in the environment will trigger you. You go past a KFC and that triggers you, and you end up stopping in there, and gets you going, and you get down this sort of process, and you end up eating way too much food, and I say, just drive home a different way, avoid the trigger." Whereas acceptance commitment therapy does the exact opposite of that. It just says, like, negative thoughts and feelings are not just inevitable; they're a completely normal part of being a functioning human being. In fact, you're hardwired to have negative thoughts and feelings because it's basically saved your life. Throughout the history of the species, you need to be pretty easily triggered to be, wanting to run away or fight for your life, because that's, that was a pretty important survival mechanism. And so, things like anger, fear, but even things like hunger, or, things that are motivating negative emotions, normal. But the modern trap we get into is to be fused to them. It's like, so I'm going to put being hungry in 3 different ways, and they're different, but something different. It's like, I'm hungry, I am hungry, as an idea of being fused, that you and hunger are the same thing. Whereas when you become more diffused, you say, I'm noticing that I'm hungry, or you might, in a more advanced form, go, I'm noticing I'm having a thought about being hungry. So they might just sound subtle, but it's really important, because I think when we engage with negative emotions and we fuse with them, we become with them, we're almost wrestling with a monster on the other side of a pit. You can imagine yourself wrestling a computer-generated monster with holding a tug of war rope or something. And the more you wrestle, the more it engages, the more energy it draws from you, the bigger it gets. So, the negative thought and feeling can't be deleted. It won't go away, but you're almost drawing it to the front and making it everything. Whereas if you just notice it, you don't give it the benefit of the wrestling, and it doesn't grow. So that's the acceptance part. And the commitment part is like, well, even if you've got negative thoughts and feelings and you're just noticing them, that's fine. What really actually counts at the end of the day is what you do. And these are generally values-based moves. So you might say, we often talk about things as being towards moves. It's like, I'm hungry, but what's my towards move? And it's like, well, I'll have a drink of water. I'll wait till I get home and then I'll make something healthy. Or an away move. Bugger it, I'll just go to the shop and have 3 chocolate bars and a can of Coke or something. So towards move moves you towards your best valued life, and an away move moves you away. And it's very easy in the context of negative thoughts and feelings, especially when you're fused to them, to make away moves. Someone cuts you off on the motorway, all of a sudden you want to beat them up. Someone annoys you at work and you get angry and you yell at them or something. Those are clearly away moves. They're not in your best interest or anyone else's. So how do you work with that? And I'll give you a good example of how useful it is, but in a completely benign situation, where you might think it's benign, is that I coach my youngest sons, the 13-year-olds, football team, soccer. No, I know nothing much about this. I never played it myself. I'm useless at it. I'm not the best coach, but one thing that's quite obvious in that, this is a boys' team for some reason, is that in every game, the ref makes a bad call, at least one, and it's at least one against us. It's often multiple. And the boys get angry about that. They fuse with that negative thought and feeling. They have complete meltdowns. And then some of the parents, especially the dads, join in as well. And then we play shit because we're all pissed off about everything. So they end up fusing and doing away moves. And you're like, oh my God, what are we going to do about that? So one time we had a tournament, local schools tournament, so it's a big deal. And had the boys at school before we went, and I was like, oh, playing this tournament. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, right. And I was like, hey, what do you reckon about the refs making bad calls today? And they're like, oh yeah, definitely going to happen. I was like, you what, against us? Like, yep. How often? Oh, every game, at least once, probably more. I was like, all right, so what can we do about that? And they're like, well, nothing. And it's like, so we've ascertained that every game we're going to be given calls that are bad and against us. I was like, well, how are you going to feel? Like, oh, we'll be fine, we'll feel good. I was like, bullshit. How are you going to feel? Like, oh yeah, we'll be pissed off. And I was like, yeah, true, I will be as well. So we know there's 100% chance this is going to happen. We've got 100% chance we're going to be angry and annoyed and not happy about it. Yep. It's like, well, what do you reckon we should actually do about it? And they're like, oh, we probably should just carry on. And so that's a towards move. And we actually won that tournament. And the funniest thing is that the main reason we won is because calls went against the other teams, and they lost their shit. And so did their parents.
They turned into obstreperous lunatics.
100%, yeah. So that's the idea of sort of, they fused with their thoughts. They started making away moves, and it seems like a good idea at the time, but in actual fact, it's not really the way to do it. So that's a good example of acceptance commitment therapy. But you can see it in much other parts of your life. Hunger is a great example, because you can become hunger and get really angry about it, and start making those away moves rather than just noticing it. Or things make you angry or fearful all the time, every day. These are normal emotions. You can't avoid them, but how do you engage with them when you can notice them, and then it gives you a little bit of space to make towards moves and away moves. Now, it's always a work in progress, right? Especially if you've got a partner and you're having a little bit of a disagreement about something, then that's a really difficult time to start to make diffuse and make towards moves. But it's it's plausibly possible, and it's certainly much more possible with kids. And then other people that you're working with, it becomes quite an easy technique. Yeah, so that's about it.
They were pretty keen on emotions as well, and these psychiatrists that did these cold water shock showers, they felt that fear was sort of the opposite of anger, and so fear could be employed to reduce anger. So they would, they would blindfold people and drop the water from on high unexpectedly, with this idea that these emotions would battle it out with each other.
Holy
And
shit! Well, I suppose, yeah, but that's pretty gnarly.
yeah, and I suppose it's interesting because yeah, the story that you told, it was interesting because it was, I guess you sort of talked about, the emotion side of things, but using your thoughts and your will to have a different outcome for.
Yeah. So you're not using your will to get rid of the thoughts. That's not a thing. But you're
Mm,
using your will to give yourself a little bit of separation from them, and that's an
mm,
entirely different thing, right? So it's a little bit
mm,
like, you've got a dog at home, and the dog's up the front of you wrestling with you with a chew toy, or the dog's just down the back of the house sleeping somewhere. The dog hasn't left the house, but they're in different parts of the
mm,
house doing different things. And negative thoughts and feelings can be like that. They can be down the back just hanging out. That's fine,
mm,
not really
mm,
doing too much. Or they can be up the
mm.
front.
Do you think that having gone in your freezer, I'm a total wuss about cold water. I can hardly even get in the sea in the summer. But what
Yeah.
do you think, for yourself, having gone in your freezer and splashed about? Do you think there's a change in your sort of emotions
Yeah, well,
coming
I
out
mean,
from that?
I should preface this by going, um, this was never my idea in the first place. It was my wife Louise who said it was a good idea, and we probably started this about 3 or 4 years ago, and um, we've got a pool in the winter. It's bloody cold. It's like 11 degrees or something. You'd never go in there, and she said we're going in, and she jumped in, and a bit of stress, and she was okay, and I jumped in, and I honestly lasted about 30 seconds. I basically had a bit of a panic, and just couldn't cope with the whole thing, and jumped out. And so, oh, that's just embarrassing. And I'd be the sort of guy who wears a wetsuit in the water in the summer, and all that sort of stuff. And so then I was like, well, I started thinking about it the first day, and I was getting more and more annoyed about this. So by the end of the day, I was like, I'm going back in, and I'm going to be psyched this time. So I got in and worked through the initial shock, and lasted 5 minutes, and then over the next week built it up to 10 minutes, and then I was like, oh, actually this is interesting, because there's quite a few changes. Like you sort of end up with that brown fat adaptation, right? You end up getting that sort of internal heater going, so you end up staying, feeling like not getting cold when you actually feel like you're generating warmth.
Mm,
um, and then I started adding in this breathing, and the technique I use and it's particularly necessary when you get into the freezer, because that's closer to 0 degrees, whereas a pool or the sea in winter is probably closer to 12 degrees. Is you just get, I use a breathing technique where I use my fingers to count things off. So I put my thumb against my index finger, and then I breathe in through my nose, hold the breath at the top, let it out again, hold it at the bottom, and that's sort of box breathing. You imagine yourself going round a square box. And if you go across your 4 fingers, then down to the next knuckle, down to the next knuckle, and down across the next knuckle, there's 16 breaths, which is about 5 minutes worth of slow box breathing in water, which is really gets you through the bulk of the initial part of getting into cold water. And it sort of also calms the mind, and that sort of thing at the same time. So yeah, that's the sort of technique that I use. It's actually strangely quite addictive, and I think part of that is it also puts up a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is more about motivation. It goes up in the 2 hours after cold water, and I think it's probably just because your body's warming up and it wants to stay motivated to warm up. Um, and that's and it dopamine is an interesting neurotransmitter, because it can be quite destructive. Like dopamine goes up when you smoke cigarettes, quite high, and that's the initial feeling most people get addicted. But then, because of neuroplasticity, it down regulates, and all you're doing is getting your dopamine back to that of a normal person by smoking.
mm,
Yeah, and then that's addiction. But cold water raises dopamine without getting that addictive part going. So that's a really interesting
mm,
thing. And I've noticed that with my boys. I've got a 22-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 13-year-old. And they all go on it. They go on this ice bath like every day, pretty much. And I'm
Wow.
been amazed by that, and it obviously makes them feel good, because I can't imagine they'd do it out of it made them feel bad. It's been surprising to me. Me and my wife just, like, wow, that's the thing.
Yeah, well, I think they back in the 1800s they were sort of appreciated that they didn't really understand the connection between the mind, the body, and the spirit. And I suppose in a lot of ways we know a lot. We've got some more ideas about how things might relate to each other, but there's still a lot we don't know. But
Okay, correct.
there's
Yeah.
certainly an amazing relationship. How you can use your body to change what you might think of as your mind, and vice
Yeah,
versa.
yeah, yeah. And like, I mean, to me, there's a sort of one other bigger picture thing that I wanted to mention at the start, but if you don't mind, I'll mention it now. In New Zealand, New Zealanders aged 16 to 24 is the group I want to talk about. They, for what it's worth, our New Zealand Health Survey measures psychological distress with a tool called the K10, and we started doing that in 2011. At which point, about 5.6% of that age group said that they had severe psychological distress at the time they filled out the survey, which is fine. And they've kept measuring that every couple of years. And in 2021, it was 24.7% or something like that, which to me is an incredible change in a demographic for psychological distress. And people don't necessarily like the message I'm going to give here, but the question is, what are some of the reasons for that? And therefore, in public health, you want to find the source of the problem, so it's a better way to find a solution, right? Remember, modern public health was born of cholera epidemics in London in the 19th century, and the best solution was to find where the contaminated water was coming from and sort it out. Like that's not a bad public health solution. And so the same with this, with what's causing the psychological distress, or is it more distress and more stress, or is it being less robust to the same stress? And there's some evidence that we're less robust, and we're certainly less fit. Our diet's worse, our sleep's worse, and those are all factors that affect how robust we are in terms of stress. And so, part of an argument is that young people are less robust specimens of the species than they perhaps used to be, and therefore part of the solution is helping us be more robust. And I'm not saying it like that to toughen up. I'm just saying that we need to take the biology of being a functioning human seriously, and that's where cold and hot and diet, exercise, sleep all fit in as robustness tools around our well-being. And people don't necessarily like that message, but on the other hand, like, getting more counsellors isn't the answer to our mental health problems. That wasn't the cause, and it's not. It might help, but it's not going to be. It's not the answer, in my opinion, at least.
So perhaps a bit more of a focus on the body side of it.
Yeah, and the body and the mind
alongside the
are
mind.
connected. Yeah, they're connected, right? And cold water is a good example of where they are connected. In a reasonably obvious way. No one jumps into a cold water without their mind being, quite involved in the process. At least that's not my experience of it. Maybe they do. But,
I'll have to give it a go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was I think that probably covers a few interesting things, hopefully, for people out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you again so much for agreeing to speak with me. Yeah, I'm very envious of your outlook out there.
Oh yeah. So that, for the people in the background, that's AT Millennium, which is the high performance sports centre up at Moringi Bay. I would say that my research centre here is not a high performance sports centre. It's called the Human Potential Centre, which is, I suppose, more about the middle performance of life, trying to be the best version of themselves. So that's what I do.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and yeah, I should mention that you have a blog that is very interesting. Again, wide range of topics that you cover.
Yeah,
So people,
profgrant.com. You can go to that and check that out. Or I do occasionally appear on social media. I'm trying to do less of that because I think it's probably not so good for your well-being. But so don't get on the social media, you guys. In fact, if you're on YouTube now, get off it.
just subscribe so that you know when the next episodes.
Yeah, there you go. That's right. So you get told rather than have to surf around and find this stuff.
All right, awesome. Thank you. Thanks for listening. You can see Professor Grant Schofield's blog at profgrant.com. Don't forget to subscribe to Dr. Steph's Showers and check out episode 1, The Birth of Showers, for more of what we were discussing today.